Hello, my name is Fiedorczuk and I teach American literature. I focus on contemporary literature and especially on contemporary poetry. That is to say, the poetry of the 20th and 21st centuries. I teach courses in 21st century poetry, so the very newest poetry, and I think this newest poetry is actually super interesting because it shows us the way in which literature and which literary imagination may help us understand and process and somehow maybe react to the really profound changes which our reality is undergoing these days. And I think the nature of these changes, this is something that's obvious to everyone, right? We all feel that the world is in a profound crisis, or actually maybe it's more pertinent to speak about a number of crises. The climate change or climate catastrophe is of course the greatest planetary crisis, but other related crises are, for instance, the problem with migrations, the migration crisis, plastic pollution, and species extinction, right? Species extinction. So people sometimes speak about the loss of biodiversity. It's a kind of euphemism, because in fact, when we talk about the loss of biodiversity, we're speaking about death, right? We're speaking about the fact that daily species of plants and animals that have been our companions in the course of our geological history are dying out. So all of these problems, all of these interrelated problems are causing a lot of anxiety, and we feel that our world is changing. We feel that this planet is undergoing a material change, but we also feel that our human reality, our social reality, our political reality is changing very quickly. And sometimes we find it hard to understand and keep up with these changes. So it is my deep conviction that literature can help us to somehow more consciously experience what is going on. And I strongly believe in the power of the imagination, in the power of the literary imagination. And to me, the part of literature where the imagination is the most wild, where it is the most unchecked, where it is the most creative is poetry. Hence, 21st century poetry is this field which I choose to examine in the greatest detail. And so the subject of this little talk today is poetry and ecology, and what the two things might have to do with one another. So the first thing which we have to emphasize, or which we have to notice, is that the crisis that I mentioned before are, to a certain extent, or perhaps even primarily, the crisis of the imagination. This is something that was first formulated by Lawrence Buell. Lawrence Buell is an American professor who started the field of eco-criticism in American literature studies. And so Lawrence Buell said that the ecological crisis is the crisis of the imagination. Now, what could this mean? I think we can look at this statement from various angles, from various perspectives. So first of all, we need to make this rather obvious observation that we do know what is the nature of the problem with the ecological devastation of the planet. We do know the problem, we do understand the problem. We do know what is the solution, for example, to climate change. We do know how to do it technically, right? So we have all the knowledge, we have all the science, and we have all the technology to counteract climate change or to mitigate climate change. And nevertheless, even though we're talking about it more and more, the appropriate actions are not undertaken, neither on individual level. I mean, some of us, of course, do try, but we feel that our attempts fail short, nor on the systemic level, nor on the political level do we undertake appropriate actions. So the problem is somewhere else, right? The problem is not in the lack of knowledge. The problem is not in the lack of technical solutions. The problem is in a kind of repression, right? The problem is that even those of us who do not negate climate science find it difficult to actually really fully understand what's happening and to what extent this crisis is going to have to change our way of living. So it is a problem of the imagination. We can't really imagine this change which is already happening in front of our eyes, but we have a very, very big difficulty in processing this change. Right, so this is one way in which we can understand this statement that the ecological crisis is the crisis of the imagination. We simply do not somehow process the scientific data and even the news that we are getting increasingly from all over the world about various catastrophes which are related to climate change. We somehow cannot process this. And the second way in which we can understand this is that the moment we begin to really be aware of what a profound problem climate catastrophe is, we get completely paralyzed. And so the only future that we can imagine is apocalyptic, right? So this is what comes to our mind. The only image of the future that comes to our mind is this apocalyptic image, the end of the world, right? So we tend to think in terms of either repression, rejecting the truth about climate catastrophe and about all these other crises, or once we stop repressing, we fall into this very apocalyptic mood, which actually is also quite useless, right? Because if we think in terms of the end of the world, if we think in terms of the apocalypse, then once again, there's nothing to be done. There's nothing that we can do. Nothing makes sense, because if the apocalypse is inevitable, then all we can do is sit back and wait. So in some sense, this solution gives us a kind of closure to our human history on this planet. But also it takes responsibility away from us, because the apocalypse is by definition inevitable. Okay, so these are at least two ways in which we can understand the contemporary planetary crisis as the crisis of the imagination, the fact that we're not quite aware of what's happening, and the fact that once we become a little bit aware of what's happening, we fall into these catastrophic scenarios, into these apocalyptic scenarios. And so perhaps one of the tasks or one of the challenges for the literary imagination nowadays would be to address this impossibility of imagining an alternative solutions or alternative futures for our culture, for our civilization on this planet.
Let's now read a fragment of a poem by Ed Robertson. This poem comes from a collection titled "To See the Earth Before the End of the World." People are grabbing at the chance to see the earth before the end of the world. The world's death, piece by piece, each longer than we. Some endings of the world overlap our lived time, skidding for generations to the crash scene of species extinction, the 5 minutes it takes for the plane to fall, the mile ago it takes to stop the train, the small bay to coast the liner into the ground, the line of title to a nation, until the land dies, the continent uninhabitable. So what you see in this poem is a juxtaposition of two time scales, because on the one hand, we have human time scale here, right? The scale of human life, which is relatively limited. And you have various endings that happen in human history, such as a plane crash, which is of course a terrible accident, but it's a small scale ending or a small scale catastrophe. And so what is one of the things which are really challenging about our time, which are challenging to the imagination and which are challenging to our souls and our psyches, is the fact that our private human times are beginning to overlap with this larger geological time of the Earth. So here, the events such as species extinction is compared to this plane crash, right? So something that belongs to the deep geological time of the Earth becomes an event in our small human lifetime. And so this is one of the things that Ed Robertson's poetry takes on. Another thing that he takes on in this book is the issue of extraction economy, which is, as we know, the source of the current planetary crisis. So when we think about extraction, we think about extracting the so-called resources, such as oil, for instance, or gas, right? So literally extracting things from the earth. But I think it is also possible to think about extraction in more metaphorical terms as a kind of attitude that we have towards everything, basically, towards experience, towards our own lives, towards time, towards one another, right? Our basic language, the basic language that we use in our everyday life is actually the language of extraction, as we try to squeeze as much as possible out of our lives, out of our relationships, out of our experiences. So this tendency, this desire to squeeze as much as possible is addressed in the very first line of the poem here. People are grabbing at the chance to see the earth before the end of the world, right? So this grabbing is what we do, even though it's probably not the best or not the most adequate strategy in the situation of crisis that we're finding ourselves in. So this is Ed Robertson. This is an old picture of the poet in Alaska. So I just wanted to mention that Ed Robertson worked in Alaska. He worked with glaciers. And so, you know, people who work with ice, who work in these in the coldest zones of the earth, are on the forefront when it comes to the awareness of climate change and to how and of how fast it's actually happening. So this disappearance of glaciers is another theme in Robertson's poetry, and there's an ironic image of people chasing glaciers, right? Because we want to see, everybody wants to see their own glacier before the glacier is gone, but actually our chasing of glaciers, of course, speeds up their disappearance. So I started from Robertson's book because it addresses this question of scale, the question of different time scales, as I said, the anthropogenic destruction of the planet, the melting of glaciers, and other phenomena connected with climate change. So his work is a good example of what Lynn Keller refers to as the self-conscious Anthropocene. Anthropocene, as most of you probably know, is a proposed geological epoch dating from the commencement of significant human impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems, including climate change and species extinction. So potential stratigraphic markers for Anthropocene would be located in mid-20th century. This is the beginning of the so-called Great Acceleration, the moment when our modern technologies are beginning to develop very, very fast, and when the level of life, when the affluence of the richer inhabitants of the earth is also beginning to grow exponentially, right? So also the disproportions in affluence among the north and the south are deepening. So this is the beginning of the Anthropocene. Mid-20th century, the symbolic beginning of the Anthropocene is the first use of the atom bomb at the end of the Second World War. So the Anthropocene, the name of the proposed new name for our geological epoch, actually means the age of man, but this name that places us at the very center is nothing to be proud of, because the ways in which geological epochs are defined link them with catastrophes. So the beginning of a new geological era is usually associated with some sort of a natural catastrophe. In the case of this particular catastrophe, it's the first time in the history of this planet that it's being caused by one of the species. In this case, it is our species, the human species. So one of the aspects of Anthropocene is the loss of biodiversity, right? So the event which is referred to as the sixth great extinction or Holocene extinction or Anthropocene extinction is the ongoing and accelerating sixth mass extinction of species resulting from the destruction of component populations, leading to eventual extirpation of entire species. So we're losing the companions that have shared our evolutionary history from the beginning of our existence on this planet. Some images to illustrate the Anthropocene and how we think about it and how it poses a challenge to our small imaginations. These images come from the Anthropocene project, which was behind the documentary film titled The Anthropocene that was quite popular in 2018. Perhaps you've seen it. If you haven't, it's worth seeing. These images, this one and this one, they are photographs by Edward Burtyński, whose technique is to show us large-scale images. So very often he shows us large pieces of landscape or large fragments of the earth, which is disturbed or transformed by human activities. So there's something both scary and fascinating about Burtyński's images, which perhaps exemplifies the sort of ambivalence that we feel all the time when we think about how powerful we are as a species, and at the same time, how very destructive this power has become. Now, this is an image that many of you have probably seen, this one or some similar ones: forest fires in 2019, Amazon burning, billions of animals dying. And this is a power plant near the Polish town of Konin. This area around Konin is very interesting because it's beautiful in terms of nature, but at the same time, it's been really deeply impacted by Poland's second biggest open pit coal mine. And so there are a number of power plants which are fueled by coal, and this is one of them, and people sometimes refer to it as the Titanic. So you can, as you can see, there's also a kind of strange, eerie beauty about these images of the Anthropocene. So a few years ago, Naomi Klein published a book that has become wildly famous and widely discussed, the book addressing extraction economy and extraction capitalism as the source of the present interrelated crisis. The title of the book is "This Changes Everything." And this is climate change, right? And according to Klein, climate change and our awareness, our growing awareness of climate change, changes everything when it comes to how we understand our functioning on this planet, right? So it exposes, for instance, our present systems, our economic system, our social system. It exposes how dysfunctional they are, right? But what I would like to suggest is that climate change and the awareness of climate change also changes everything when it comes to how we practice art. It changes everything when it comes to how we write and read. It changes everything when it comes to how we practice humanities, right? So environmental humanities nowadays, at this moment, has to address this profound material change that our planet is undergoing. So let us take a look at an older poem. It's a poem by Walt Whitman, 19th century American poet. We'll just look at it very quickly. Whitman says, "Give me the splendid silent sun with all his beams full dazzling. Give me juicy autumnal fruit, ripe and red from the orchard. Give me a field where the unmowed grass grows. Give me an arbor. Give me the trellised grape." So I'll skip a little bit. "Give me solitude," he says at the end. "Give me nature. Give me again, oh nature, your primal sanities." So Walt Whitman could turn to nature with a capital N, right, in the 19th century, looking for solitude, looking for primal sanities, looking for something original, looking for a relief perhaps from civilization and things like that. So nowadays, of course, it would be completely impossible to write a poem like this, right? This notion of nature with a capital N makes no sense. It was in the year 1989 when Bill McKibben, one of the world's leading climate activists, published the first popular book about climate change, and the title of McKibben's book was "The End of Nature." So now let us look at what happens after the end of nature. Let me share my screen once more. So this is a poem by A.R. Emmons. It's the beginning of a poem that comes from a book titled Garbage. Emmons says, "Garbage has to be the poem of our time because garbage is spiritual, believable enough to get our attention, getting in the way, piling up, stinking, turning brooks brownish and creamy white, and so on and so forth." So you see the difference, right, between the 19th century poet Walt Whitman, who turns to capitalist nature for some sort of inspiration and respite from civilization and for wisdom, and to Emmons, who has no option like that, right? Because in late 20th century, Garbage comes from 1993. The material reality of the planet has already changed, right? So to be a poet who really addresses the environment, who really engages with the reality of what is happening with the planet, you need to address garbage. So these are some of the poets who are actively responding to the crisis of the Anthropocene, who are writing in the 21st century. So these names are associated with the very newest developments in American poetry. We discuss all of them in various courses. And basing on their work, I have come up with several tasks for poetry that I think it is possible to see being addressed in the most contemporary experimental work. Yes, the task is in quotation marks because it's always hard to speak about the tasks of art, as anybody who is an artist of any sort will realize. It's very hard to use your art in the service of a cause, even if it's a cause that you believe in, right? But it seems to me, without prescribing, without being prescriptive towards the work that we're looking at, it seems to me that these tasks emerge out of these poetic practices. So in other words, it's not something that I am prescribing for poets to follow, but it's something that emerges out of the work that actually gets written in the 21st century. So the first task, right, or the first challenge is to tell the truth. So when you saw this difference between Whitman and Emmons, this is about truth. Welcome the pain of knowing. Yes, it's a phrase that I like. So that's what poetry must do, because we don't often do it in our daily life, but it is an important spiritual or emotional task that art has to perform, to welcome the pain of knowing about the dimensions of destruction that is going on, right? Welcome the pain of knowing and perform the work of mourning. for the species that we're losing, for the people that we're losing, for ways of life and human cultures that are being lost at accelerating pace nowadays. The second task is to question anthropocentrism. So to question this idea that humans are at the center of the world, that we're the most important, that our interests are the most important, that only our way of looking and only our perspective is worth taking into consideration, and that other beings, other processes, other phenomena on this planet have no agency, have no meaning, have no value. To reject the dichotomy between nature and culture. This dichotomy makes no sense anymore. First of all, because nature is gone. Nature with capital N from Whitman's poem no longer exists. Second of all, because it has never existed. There has never been a separate realm of nature which would be completely separate from what is called culture. And there has never been a realm of culture that would be independent of this planet. Everything that we're doing, all of our cultures, all of our cultural practices are actually deeply embedded in the laws of physics, in the laws of nature, if you will, on this particular planet. In other words, there's no outside to nature, right? There's no outside to ecology. Whatever it is that we're discussing, whatever aspect of culture we're dealing with, we're always dealing with some variant of ecology. The next task, decolonize, right? So address the issue, the crucial issue, the central issue of extraction economy. Extraction economy was historically from the very beginning associated with colonialism, with going outside of Europe and extracting not just the resources of the earth, but also the resources of human bodies, of non-white bodies. So this has to stop. This is a very important task for thinking nowadays. Now, one of the questions which I think are also super interesting is this question of eco-poetics. So the question of experimental poetics, the question of experimenting with form in newest poetry in such a way as to somehow address, by means of form, by means of poiesis, by means of poetic experiment, the changes which are happening on the planet. So this new poetics that is seen all over the place, that is seen in poetry, but that is also seen, for example, in visual arts, reflects the growing awareness that all of the processes and phenomena on the earth are interconnected. This is the new knowledge given to us by science that we have to acknowledge, that we have to really become aware of. And experimental poetry can help us gain a deeper awareness of this fundamental fact. To overcome separation is another task. In other words, to resituate humans in ecological terms and to restate the non-human processes, the non-human beings in ethical terms, right? So our ethics has to include the modern human world, and our understanding of ourselves as human beings has to be ecological. We have to understand ourselves as earthlings. Primarily, before we're anything else, we're earthlings. Finally, the most exciting new task for poetry is to look for new forms of knowledge, right? Because we need an epistemological revolution. We have to stop limiting our ways of knowing each other, our ways of knowing ourselves, our ways of knowing the planet and our companion beings on this planet, merely through instrumental reason, right? Merely through the kind of reason that understands everything in terms of how useful it can potentially be to the purposes of capitalism based on growth and extraction. And so I'll end this little talk with a quote from one of my favorite poets, Brenda Hillman. This is a quote from her book that came out a few years ago titled Practical Water. Hillman says, if bees can detect ultraviolet rays, there are surely more possibilities in language and government. The possible is boundless. So Hillman's aspiration and her call to artists is to use imagination in order to somehow reconnect with the wild places in ourselves and with the wild places on the planet, and to use the imagination to actually invent, to find and invent collaboratively with other artists, with perhaps even non-human artists, to find other ways of organizing the future on this planet, other ways, other possibilities than this apocalyptic possibility, which is the first one, the first vision, the first possibility that come to our mind when we begin to be aware of the climate catastrophe and related planetary crisis. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you one day, perhaps in one of my classes.